The board vote was scheduled for the third Thursday in April. Margaret Oakes had 12 days to prepare transition plans for 12 children who did not yet know they were being moved. That was the situation on the morning an 11-year-old girl named Cecily Marsh sat down at a library computer, opened a browser, and typed in a name she had found on a volunteer sign in sheet from the previous September. She had been working toward this moment for 4 months. She had a spiral notebook in her bag, green, college-ruled, the cover soft from being carried everywhere. And on the first page she had written, in her careful handwriting, "Things I know for certain." Below that, a list. It was not a long list, but everything on it had been earned through the same method she was using now. Patience, and paying attention, and the understanding that if something was happening around you that you did not yet understand, the right response was to keep watching until you did. She had been watching since October. She had been watching since the morning Margaret came back from the mailbox with an envelope she had not been expecting and sat down at the kitchen table and was quiet for a long moment before she looked up and said, "To no one in particular, someone is looking out for us." Cecily had written that down too. The name she typed into the search bar that morning in April was not the name she would have guessed. But when the results came back and she looked at the photograph, she was not surprised. She had seen this person before. She had written him down. She had not yet figured out what to do with knowing. She was about to. Ridgeway Children's Home has been on the east slope of Queen Anne Hill in Seattle, Washington, since 1977. The building is a 3-story craftsman that was converted from a private residence by a retired schoolteacher named Eleanor Ridgeway, who decided, at 62, that the best use of a house too large for one person was to fill it with children who needed one. She ran it for 9 years herself. After her death, it passed to a nonprofit board, which has operated it since, through 3 directors and 4 capital campaigns, and the particular financial precarity that attaches to small residential care institutions that are too important to close and not important enough to fund reliably. In the years Cecily had been there, it held between 10 and 14 children at any given time. The backyard had an apple tree that produced in September, and a swing set that was older than most of the children, and a vegetable garden that the older kids planted in April and mostly forgot about by July. The kitchen smelled of whatever Margaret had been making that morning, which was almost always something from scratch, because Margaret believed that the smell of cooking was the smell of being cared for, and she maintained this position even when the budget made it complicated. The budget had been making most things complicated for 3 years. The operating debt had reached $47,000 by February. The property was worth $2.3 million. The board had hired a financial consultant whose report ran 14 pages and reached the same conclusion on page 3 that any clear-eyed reading of the numbers reached. Arthur Pennell, the board chairman, had moved to begin transition planning at the March meeting. The vote had passed 4-2. Margaret Oakes had been director for 12 of the home's 47 years. She had sat in the board meeting and listened to the motion and written the number 4 on her notepad, 4 in favor, and then sat in her car in the parking lot for 35 minutes before driving back to the home. She had not yet told the children. Arthur Pennell was 62 years old and had been chairman of the Ridgeway board for 14 years. He had made his career in logistics, a company he had built from a regional freight operation into a mid-sized enterprise, which he had sold at 55 for enough money to retire comfortably and spend the remaining years of his life on the board memberships and the advisory roles and the philanthropic work that constituted the second act of people who had built things and were not quite ready to stop. He was organized and direct and had the particular patience of someone who has spent 3 decades running things, a patience for process, for the long view, for the decision that holds rather than the one that feels satisfying. He was not a cruel man. He had not enjoyed the vote in March. He had made it because the numbers required it, and because running a failed institution for the benefit of feelings was not service to the children it housed. It was a postponement of an inevitable harm that would only grow. He had told himself this in the parking lot after the meeting, and in the kitchen that evening, and in the specific hours of 3 a.m. that had been arriving more reliably since his wife died. His wife, Eleanor, not the Eleanor Ridgway who had founded the home. A coincidence he had mentioned to her once, and that she had found either meaningful or convenient depending on the day she was having, had died 26 months ago of a cancer that had announced itself late. They had been married for 31 years. She had been the one who suggested the board 14 years ago when she found the home listed in a community newsletter and said it sounded like something that could use his skills. He had said yes before she finished explaining. He had never told her why he said yes so quickly. He had been 8 years old when his mother was hospitalized for what was described to him, at the time, as an illness that needed treatment and that would take several months. He was placed with a family he did not know through a state arrangement for 22 weeks. The family was not unkind, the house was not dangerous, but it was not his, and the weeks did not feel like weeks. They felt like something he had agreed to carry and was not sure he would be able to put down again. His mother recovered. He went home. He did not speak about the 22 weeks to anyone, not throughout his childhood and not in his adulthood, and not to Eleanor, even after 31 years of the kind of marriage where most things get said eventually. He had filed it somewhere specific, not forgotten, but not visited, and he had spent 54 years making decisions based on a version of himself that did not include it. By 62, that filing had held so long that he had stopped being aware it was there. He looked at the $47,000 and the $2.3 million and made the motion, and the motion passed, and 12 children had 12 days before they would be told. The first donation had arrived the first week of October. An envelope addressed to Ridgway Children's Home, no return address, containing a money order for $500 and no note. Margaret had taken it to the bank without knowing what to make of it. The second came in November, $1,200. This time a wire transfer, the routing information tracing back to a bank with branches across 3 states. Enough to cover the furnace repair that had been deferred since September, with $140 left over. The third, in December, $800. Spent on winter coats for 12 children and a pair of boots for Cecily, who had mentioned to Margaret in passing, once, that her old ones let in water. Cecily was the one who noticed the boots. She had not asked for them. She had not told anyone she needed them except Margaret, briefly in a conversation that had moved on quickly. The boots appeared in December in a box with the other coats. No explanation. Exactly her size. She sat with this for a long time. Then she opened her notebook and wrote, "The person sending the money knows what we need. They are paying attention." She had started tracking in November when she heard Margaret tell the cook that a wire transfer had covered the furnace. She began writing down the date of each donation, the amount, and what it was used for. She wrote down what had gone wrong the week before each donation arrived. She wrote down who had been at the home recently, who might have seen or heard about the need before it became a need that was covered. By February, she had 7 entries. Every one had been preceded by a specific, observable need. Every donation had been sized, approximately, to that need. Someone was watching the home, not from inside it, but closely enough to know. She thought about who had been at Ridgway in September, the month before the first donation. There had been a volunteer day, a group of 23 people who had come to help with maintenance and yard work. She had not paid much attention to most of them. But she had paid attention to one. He had been fixing a section of the back fence when she came outside to read, and he had looked up and asked her what she was reading, without making it a performance of interest, the way adults sometimes did. She had shown him the cover. He had said he had not read it, but that the title was a good one. Then he had gone back to the fence. She had written him in her notebook that afternoon, in the way she wrote people who seemed worth remembering. Dark jacket, quiet. The kind of person who looks at you like you're the whole sentence. She thought about the projector. In January, the home's movie night projector had stopped working. Margaret had mentioned it at dinner, not as a complaint, just as a fact. Movie night would need to wait until the spring fundraiser. The January donation had arrived 9 days later, $1,700, which was more than enough for the projector and covered 3 weeks of groceries. Nobody outside the home had known about the projector except the volunteers from September, who had been using it when it was set up for the end-of-day gathering before everyone left. Cecily had written, "The projector." He was there. She went to Margaret and asked if she still had the sign-in sheet from the volunteer day. Margaret looked at her carefully, then got the folder. The sheet showed 23 first names and the city each volunteer had listed as their home. Next to the 6th name, K, Seattle, someone had drawn a small star, in pencil. That might have been decorative, or might have been Margaret's own marking from the day. The volunteer organization had posted a group photo on their website. Cecily found it at the library 2 days later. She found K in the back row. She looked at his face for a long time. She right-clicked on the image, opened a second tab, and ran a reverse search. She sat very still for a moment when the results came back. Then she opened her notebook to the first page. She added one item to the list of things she knew for certain and underlined it and closed the notebook and sat with it for 3 weeks without telling anyone. Margaret gathered the children in the living room on the second Tuesday in April. She sat in the chair by the window, the one she always used for important conversations, and she told them the truth the way she told them everything. Directly, without softening it past the point of honesty. With the acknowledgement that it was hard, and the assurance that they would get through it together. She told them the home was going to close. She told them it was not because of anything they had done or not done. She told them that plans were being made for each of them, that they would be involved in those plans, and that she would be there through every step. The room was very quiet. Cecily was sitting on the floor with her back against the couch. She had her notebook in her lap. She was not looking at Margaret. She was looking at the window. That evening, after dinner, and after the younger children were settled, she sat at the kitchen table and wrote a letter. It took her 4 drafts. The final version was 1 page, in her careful handwriting, and it said, "Dear Sir, I know it's you because of the projector, and the boots, and the fence. I thought you should know that the home is closing in 12 days. I don't know if you can do anything about that. I don't know if you'd want to. But you've been paying attention to us for 7 months, and I thought you deserved to know what's happening. Margaret doesn't know I'm writing this. I'm writing it because knowing something that might matter and not saying anything with it seems like the wrong choice. C.M." She found the volunteer organization's mailing address and sent it the following morning before school, with a note on the outside of the envelope asking them to forward it if they were able. The letter arrived at its destination 6 days later. Arthur Pennell's office was on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Seattle, with a view of the Sound on clear days. He was reviewing the transition timeline documentation when his assistant told him there was someone who had called to request a meeting. not through the board's standard process, not about any of Arthur's professional work. A personal matter related to the Ridgeway board. The meeting was set for the following morning. The man who came in was wearing a dark jacket and was alone, and did not have a briefcase or a folder or anything prepared. Arthur stood to greet him and registered, in the fast way he had registered people across 30 years of business, that this was someone who did not need the room to know who he was, which was information of a particular kind. Arthur's assistant had not recognized the name when it was given. Arthur had looked it up after the call and had sat with what the search returned for a moment before continuing with his afternoon. "Thank you for seeing me," Keanu Reeves said. He sat down in the chair across the desk. "I'll be direct. I've been connected to Ridgeway Children's Home for the past several months, and I understand the board has voted to begin transition. I wanted to talk to you about that before it goes further." Arthur folded his hands on the desk. "May I ask in what capacity?" "As someone who has been paying attention to it." He paused. "I was there on a volunteer day in September. I came back in other ways after that." A pause. "I should tell you that a child at the home wrote to me, an 11-year-old who had been tracking the donations and figured out where they were coming from. She wrote to tell me what was happening." Arthur was quiet for a moment. "Cecily," he said. "I don't know her last name." "Cecily Marsh." Arthur looked at his desk. "She's been there 2 years. He stopped. "She's a perceptive child. She wrote me a letter with better reasoning in it than most adults produce in a meeting." He was quiet for a moment. "She said knowing something that might matter and not saying anything with it seemed like the wrong choice." The room held that sentence for a moment. "I've reviewed the financial situation," Keanu said. "The debt is $47,000. The consultant's report is thorough. The logic of the recommendation is sound if the only variables are the ones in the report." He looked at Arthur. "I'd like to cover the debt. I'm not asking for anything in return. I'm not asking for a naming opportunity or a board seat or any acknowledgement. I'd like to cover it and for the home to continue." Arthur looked at him. "The board made a responsible decision based on the information it had," Arthur said. "Accepting a single large gift to cover a structural deficit doesn't solve the structural problem. What happens in another 2 years when the deficit rebuilds?" "That's a real question," Keanu said. "And I'd like to talk about it, because I think it has an answer. But I'd like to ask you something first, if that's all right." Arthur nodded. "You've been on the Ridgeway board for 14 years. He said it without emphasis. "That's a long time to give to something. I want to understand what brought you there initially, not the skills you offered. The reason you said yes." Arthur looked at his hands. "My wife suggested it." "What made you say yes when she did?" Arthur was quiet. He looked at the view of the Sound. Outside, the water was gray-green in the April light, the kind of color that held things without revealing them. "I had a period, when I was young," he said, "when I was placed in a temporary home. My mother was unwell. It was about 5 months." He said it with the compression of someone who has not said it recently and is unsure how much of it belongs to the room. "It was not a bad experience in any dramatic sense. But I understood during those months what it meant to be somewhere that wasn't yours. And I have not revisited that understanding very often in the years since." Keanu did not say anything immediately. He let the sentence have its space. 14 years on the board," he said finally. 4 votes to close." He looked at Arthur. "What do you think those 5 months would have meant to you if the home you were in had been closed because the numbers didn't work?" Arthur opened his mouth. He closed it. Outside, a ferry crossed the Sound. The wake spread and then smoothed. Arthur watched it, until it was gone. "I want to ask you something else," Keanu said. "And this one is harder." He paused. Cecily wrote that she was sending the letter because knowing something that might matter and saying nothing with it seemed like the wrong choice. She wrote that at 11 years old, about a decision that had no clear upside for her. He looked at Arthur steadily. "What do you think she was hoping would happen when she sent it?" Arthur looked at the desk. "She was hoping someone would come," he said. Keanu said, "Someone came." The conversation in Arthur Pennell's office lasted 1 hour and 40 minutes. When it ended, Arthur sat at his desk for a while after the door closed. He looked at the sound. He looked at his phone. Then he made a call, not to any member of the Ridgeway board, not to the financial consultant. He called a man he had known for 20 years, a former business partner who had moved into real estate development and who had the capacity, if motivated, to organize the kind of institutional support that transformed a small nonprofit's structural situation in ways that a single gift, however large, could not sustain alone. Arthur had not called this man on Ridgeway's behalf before because asking felt like an admission that he had not been managing the board's resources well enough. He called him now. The conversation lasted 22 minutes. After it, Arthur called Margaret Oakes. He said that the transition planning should be paused pending a board reconvening, which he was scheduling for the following week. He said he had new information. He said she should tell the children nothing yet. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then, "Arthur." "Yes, what happened?" "Someone came," he said. "I'll explain at the meeting." He drove to the home that evening. He had not done this before, visited outside of official events or inspections. He pulled up and sat in the car for a moment, looking at the Craftsman house on the slope of Queen Anne Hill, the lights on inside, the apple tree in the backyard visible over the roofline. He got out and knocked. Margaret answered the door and looked at him with the specific expression of someone who has been managing uncertainty for 2 weeks and is not quite ready to believe it might be ending. He said, "Is Cecily available?" Ridgeway Children's Home did not close. The board met the following week and voted to accept the restructuring proposal Arthur presented, which included the debt coverage. A new fundraising structure with 2 anchor donors who had committed to multi-year support, and a revised operational model that Margaret had actually proposed 18 months earlier and that the board had tabled as aspirational. It was no longer tabled. It was adopted, with modifications, and Margaret began implementing it the following month. Arthur's involvement with the home changed, not dramatically. He remained board chairman, ran the meetings with the same organized directness, produced the same clean quarterly reports. But he began doing something he had not done in 14 years on the board. He came by. Not for inspections, not for events, just to be there, in the building, in the way that a person is present when they have remembered why they are somewhere. He learned the children's names. He learned which ones liked to talk and which ones needed the particular respect of not being asked questions. He ate dinner there twice in the first month and helped Ray, the cook at the home, figure out why the kitchen's second burner had been running uneven since February. He was not good at this, the fixing, the practical work, and he was not pretending to be good at it, and that turned out to matter in a way he had not anticipated. He also told Margaret for the first time about the 22 weeks at 8 years old. He did not tell all of it. He told enough. Margaret listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "I've been wondering for 14 years why you were on this board." She paused. "I'm glad you finally told me." The home's financial situation stabilized over the following 18 months. Not without difficulty, there were 2 months in the first year when the operating numbers were close. And 1 month when Arthur made a personal bridge transfer without telling the board until the following meeting. It was not the last time. He stopped counting after a while. Cecily Marsh turned 12 that summer, and 13 the following summer, and 14 the summer after that. Each birthday at Ridgeway with the apple tree dropping its fruit in September, and the swing set older each year and movie nights running on the new projector that had arrived the previous January in a box with no note. She kept the notebook. She filled 2 more over the following 3 years. The lists of things she knew for certain grew longer and then were joined by other lists, things she was still working out, things she had been wrong about, things she had learned from being wrong. She showed the notebooks to Margaret. Sometimes. She showed one once to Arthur, who read the entry about the man who looked at you like you were the whole sentence, and then sat quietly for a moment, and then gave the notebook back without comment, which was the right response. In the fall of her 14th year, a couple who had been considering fostering for 2 years, who had been stopped by a combination of doubt and paperwork, and the specific fear of getting it wrong, attended an open house at Ridgeway that Margaret had organized as part of the new outreach program. They met Cecily. They asked her what she was reading. She showed them the cover. The man said he had not read it, but the title was a good one. The woman said she had read it twice. Cecily looked at them for a moment and then wrote their names in her notebook. The fostering relationship began that November. It took the shape that these things take, slowly, carefully, with setbacks and adjustments, and the patience required when something important is being built rather than simply decided. At 15, Cecily moved in with them on a trial basis. She took the green notebook. The last entry she wrote at Ridgeway, on the morning she left, was added to the first page. It went under the list of things she knew for certain. 7 words. Sometimes the right person gets the letter. Years later, in a piece she wrote for a small publication, she had become a journalist, which surprised no one who had known her at 11. She described growing up at Ridgeway, and the months she had spent tracking the anonymous donations, and the morning she had typed a name into a library computer and understood something about the distance between knowing something and doing something with it. She described writing the letter. She did not name the donor. She said only that someone had been paying attention for 7 months, and that this attention had taken a form that anyone could see the results of, but that no one was supposed to trace back. And that she had traced it back anyway because she thought that was important, and that she had been right. She said the thing that stayed with her all those years later was not the donation or the outcome or even the letter. It was the volunteer day in September. The man at the fence. The question about the book she was reading, not performed, not strategic, just genuine. The look that came with it. She said she had been paying attention all those years because someone showed her. In a September afternoon, that paying attention was worth doing. That, she said, was what she had actually been given. I have been thinking about what it means to give without waiting to be found out. Not what it means strategically, not as a theory of charitable giving or a principle of generosity. What it means as an experience, the deliberate choice to send the thing, month after month, and return to your day without checking whether it arrived or what it covered, or what any of the people inside that building knew about where it came from. That is harder than it sounds. I think most of us, when we help someone, carry at least a small portion of the helping in the direction of being known to have helped, not because we are selfish, because we are human, and being known is part of how humans operate. The acknowledgement is not the goal, but it is something. Most of us need at least a little of it. What strikes me about 7 months of anonymous money orders and wire transfers is the absence of that. The choice to send the boots in exactly the right size, without any mechanism for the child to know where they came from. To let the furnace repair happen and the projector arrive and the coats appear and never connect any of it to a name. To give in a form that is complete without acknowledgement, that does not need to be found to have worked. And then a child found it anyway. An 11-year-old with a green notebook and the specific patience of someone who has learned that the world reveals itself if you watch long enough. She found it, and she held it for 3 weeks, and she wrote a letter. Because knowing something that might matter and saying nothing seemed like the wrong choice. She had distilled, at 11, the single most important thing about what to do with what you know. I also think about Arthur, at 8 years old, in a house that was not his. The weeks that did not feel like weeks. The thing he had carried for 54 years and not visited, that a conversation in an office finally opened, not all at once, not completely, but enough to change what he did with the years that remained. Enough for him to drive to a house on Queen Anne Hill on a Tuesday evening and knock on the door and ask if Cecily was available. I don't know what he said to her that evening. Margaret told me the conversation lasted 40 minutes, and that when Arthur left, Cecily went upstairs and wrote something in her notebook, and did not show it to anyone for 3 years. I think about what it means to have someone show up because of a letter you sent in the dark, without knowing if it would reach anyone. I think about being 11 and understanding, from that the reaching was worth doing, even when you couldn't know. That is not a small thing to learn at 11. It is not a small thing to carry. This story is fictional, inspired by Keanu Reeves's well-known reputation for giving in ways designed never to be found out. Drop a comment, not about what you thought of the story, but about something someone did for you anonymously, or something you did for someone else without needing them to know. Those moments deserve to be said out loud, even if the names stay quiet. If someone needs this today, send it to them. Subscribe for more stories like this one. See you in the next one.